I'm Amruta Ruikar, Executive, International Promotions and International Student Relations, and will be the official Master of Ceremonies for the inaugural session today and the sessions tomorrow. As you all are well aware, the conference will be inaugurated by the Chief Guest, Honorable Shri Mohammad Hamid Ansari Ji, Vice President of India. Honorable Shri Vidyasagar Rao, Governor of Maharashtra, and Shri Girish Bapat, Guardian Minister for Pune, will be the guests of honor for this inaugural function. For security reasons, the audience must be seated 45 minutes prior to the arrival of the Vice President. As organizers, we realize how taxing that may be and would like to keep you engaged during this period. May I now request the faculty and students of the Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts to give you a brief look at the history and the present of this region. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Link West India and Gulf Conference 2015. India has had relations with the West Asian region way back in the historical time frame. One of the earliest references to the West Asian region may be dated back to the Mahabharata. Needless to say that the Gandharva school of sculpture, famous used for the Buddha statues in Ajanta and Ellora caves, is a contribution from Afghanistan. Similarly, the spread of Buddhism to that region is evident in the Bamiyan Buddhas till their destruction by the Taliban militants. The great Indian tradition of confluence of world religions and civilizations was further enriched with the entry of Islam in the 8th century. The Turkish and Mughal civilizations gave us perhaps everything, from monuments to the Din of Akbar and of course the Taj Mahal. The increasing ties between West Asia and the Indian subcontinent reached a rock bottom during the colonial era. The modern history of West Asia and Gulf region in the shadows of colonialism and nationalism is a story steeped in anguish, violence, death and destruction. But out of such chaos and mayhem, the seeds of a volatile and yet vibrant West Asia were sown. This fascinating story is worthy to be told innumerable times. With the latest series of revolutions taking place in the region, the Arab Spring has generated renewed interest in the political economy of the region and its ramifications for world economy. The students of Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts, Vividha, Ira, Ratish and Ankita, in what follows will provide us an overview of the chief events which took place in West Asia and the Gulf regions in the 20th century. We hope that this generic overview will provide the necessary background for the 2 days conference and the many enriching talks by the eminent dignitaries assembled here. Thank you.
We are students from Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts studying international relations and are intrigued by the current events unfolding in the West Asian region. Reverberations of the Arab Spring have made the region a hub of global attention. As the old political order changes, sectarian clashes in several countries have taken place. Another significant dimension of the fluctuating geopolitics is the growing pan-Asian economic linkage. Due to the deepening of oil energy ties between Asia and the Gulf, several nations have developed major stakes in the process of stability in the West Asian region. The region remains India's largest socio-economic partner and the main source of India's hydrocarbon imports. Therefore, any developments in the region will inevitably have major implications for India. A host of interconnected variables are at work and constantly shape the regional environment. The processes of conflict and cooperation have historically manifested themselves in their location, spanning across time and space. Issues of territorial integrity, state sovereignty, and national identity under varied regimes have defined the socio-economic and political dynamics of the region. A pertinent challenge has been to reconcile the heterogeneity of religious ideologies, ethnic multiplicities, and languages. Before we continue with an overview of the West Asian region, we would like to show you a brief video. Thank you.
sense that I think a lot of the people there from Syria are wondering if this is going to be where they spend the rest of their lives. I'm Lucian Perkins. I'm a photographer and filmmaker in Washington, D.C. I traveled to Jordan with the Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which is a part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we traveled to Jordan to basically have a first-hand look at the Syrian refugee crisis there. We traveled to Satri refugee camp, which now has 100,000 refugees. It's the fourth largest city in Jordan. It was built for 50,000 refugees, and at one point was close to 120,000. I will say that compared to other refugee camps that I've been to, it's very well maintained by both the UNHCR and the Jordanian government. But a refugee camp is a refugee camp, and many of them now have been there for 1 to 2 years. We then went to the border of Jordan and Syria, and the day that we were there, 1,000 refugees crossed. It reminded me of similar circumstances that I'd documented before. For example, the war in Kosovo, where the day that I arrived there, 15,000 refugees were stuck at the border. Many of them had the same shock expression of the day before we were at home eating dinner with our families, now we're thrust out of our country. And many of them have, at this stage, have no idea what their future is going to be for them or their families. The last night that I was there, I spent time with the family. They sold their car, came to Jordan with their life savings, but within a year, all that money's gone. You know, when they lived in Syria, he witnessed a neighbor's children getting killed. Saw them bring the bodies out. The girls were raped, they were stabbed. He had to bury them. And he said, I don't want this to happen to my daughters. So they fled. But they're typical of the families that do come into Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq from Syria. They've lost everything. They're trying to figure out a way to salvage the lives that their children have lost, educate them, and just put food on the table.
Next slide. So this is a map of West Asia. I just wanted to clarify that for the purposes of our presentation, we consider West Asia to be the geographical area that extends from Tunisia in North Africa to Iran. In spite of the fact that Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia are North African nations, they are conventionally considered a part of West Asia because they're Arabic-speaking countries. This is an outline of our presentation. I'll just run you through it. We're tracing the history of West Asia back to the imperial history, the imperial period of West Asia. Now, the imperial period of this region's history is an important era because that was when the seeds of nationalism, sovereignty, and state formation were sown in the region. We're then looking at the rise of Arab nationalism in the early 1900s and the idea that the countries of the region would consolidate themselves into a single unified entity. We're then looking at the conflicts that took place in the region from the 1940s to the 1980s. And we're then following through with the look at the implications of the first Gulf War in 1991. We're then coming on to the 2000 period where we're looking at 9/11 and the war on terror, particularly with regard to the situation in Iraq. We're then looking at the wave of political change that came into the region from 2010 onwards with Arab Spring, and subsequently the initiation of the years-long Syrian civil war and the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS, in the region. We're then looking at the economic prospects for the region in light of the ongoing situation. And finally, we're giving a brief look at India and West Asia and the links between the two.
West Asia faces today, and also India's relations with West Asia has got much to do with its past. In fact, even 100 years ago, most of these nations weren't even formed. So in order to understand the formation of these nations and the issues that we face today, we need to dig a little bit into its history. Now, the 1800s was a very important era not only for West Asia, but also for Europe. It is in this time that we see a shift in the power dynamics of the European theater, and right in the middle of this is West Asia. We see a decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s. The Ottoman Empire, which is one of the greatest empires that to have existed. It had its territories right from Egypt all the way to the Balkans. Its importance cannot be denied simply because it controlled most of the sea routes for trade. So obviously, when the Ottoman Empire started declining in the 1800s, we see the Europeans suddenly having a lot of interest in this region. Can we move on to the next slide, please? It was in 1798 that Napoleon gets a foothold in Egypt, which is a province of the Ottoman Empire. It was the first time that the Europeans realized that the Ottomans can be defeated. Now, this is extremely important because when the French retreated from Egypt, Muhammad Ali takes control of Egypt. Egypt now no longer is a part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1830s, another province, Greece, gains independence from Ottoman Empire. So what we now see is the Ottomans losing a lot of its territory in Asia as well as in Europe. From the 1830s itself, Britain found the Ottoman region extremely important because of its because it provided the safest trade route for them. At the same time, Russian expansionism was looking towards the Ottomans to expand their territories. Now, when the Crimean War broke out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the French and the Britain decided to side with the Ottomans simply because they felt a little concerned with Russia's growing influence in the Balkan region. Therefore, in order to maintain the balance of power, they sided with the Ottomans and defeated Russia. Unfortunately, for the Ottoman Empire, their economic situation reduced drastically after this war. Another important event in the 1800s, of course, was the construction of the Suez Canal. Muhammad Ali's grandson, Ismail, supported the construction of the Suez Canal. This aroused Britain's interest in Egypt, quite obviously because passage through the Suez Canal means Britain no longer has to go all the way from Africa to reach its colony in India, and it also save up a month's travel time. Subsequently, we see Britain entering Egypt in 1882. At the same time, we also see the Great Game. The Great Game is basically a term used to talk about the rivalry between Russia and Britain over India. You see, Russia was looking towards India to expand its territory, and Britain quite obviously wanted to defend its colony. Unfortunately, though, Persia gets stuck in between. Because of Persia's geographical location, it becomes a buffer zone between Russia and Britain. And unfortunately for Persia, in 1907, most of its territories get divided between Russia and Britain. Another very important event happened in the early 1900s. They found oil in Persia. We shall get back to that point later. With the Balkan Wars, Ottomans lose most of their territories in Europe again, including Montenegro, Serbia, so on and so forth. During the First World War, the Ottomans decided to side with the Central Powers against the Allies. As a consequence of losing the war, we see the Ottoman Empire dissolved in 1923. Turkey emerges as the Republic of Turkey, but most of its provinces become either French or British mandates. Now, there already was a rise of nationalistic ideas in the late 1800s in the Ottoman empires. Now, nationalism means the feeling of oneness amongst people on a common ground. In 1876, the first constitution was drafted in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had a multi-ethnic set of set of people, and they wanted to use that common ground to be loyalty to the Ottoman Empire, to its territories. Unfortunately though, because the Ottomans' decreasing influence in the area and its fragmentation, it didn't quite work out well for them. What we do see happening though is the rise of Turkish nationalism and Arab nationalism. Now these movements are extremely important simply because they were one of the earliest movements of nationalism in the area. With the withdrawal of European imperialism, what we see is a number of nationalist groups emerging in demanding sovereignty for their territories. One of them, of course, was the Young Turks, demanding voting for Turkish nationalism. As a consequence of the Second World War, most of the provinces became either British or French mandates. Now the Arab nations weren't really happy with this. There was a cry for Arab unity, which eventually led to Arab nationalism.
In the years immediately after the Second World War, we saw the formation of the Arab League in 1945. This was a definitive symbol of Arab nationalism and Arab unity in the region. The Arab League is an association of all the countries in the region that are Arabic speaking or have Arabic as an official language. At the moment, there are presently 22 member countries, which are these. Egypt was one of the founding members, and all the general secretaries of the Arab League are Egyptians, have been Egyptians. Next. Okay, next slide. Okay. From the 1940s to the 1980s, there were a series of conflicts in the region, and they were part of the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. We want to view this also in the larger Cold War that was playing out in the international system. The series of wars were in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War, which was sparked off after Israel declared independence. In 1967, you had the Six-Day War, which is a war between Israel on one side and Syria and Egypt on the other, regarding the issue of territorial integrity. In 1973, you had the Yom Kippur War, and this sparked off the petrodollar crisis, where oil prices shot up, and this adversely affected the global economy, particularly the American economy. In 1982, you had the Lebanon War, where Israel went into Lebanon for a period of 3 months, and that conflict escalated as well. As a result of these series of conflicts, what you saw in the 1970s was a fragmentation in the region itself, and differences between Arab countries themselves started emerging, and this was particularly due to the different allegiances with regard to the Cold War. So some countries were supporting the Soviet Union, some countries were supporting the United States, and some countries like Egypt were part of the non-aligned movement. So there was a fragmentation in the region in the 1970s. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is an important event in the region. It served to realign the geostrategic landscape of the region. The Iranian Revolution saw the overthrow of the Iranian ruler Shah Raza Pahlavi, and as a result, Iran transitioned from a monarchy to a theocratic state with the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, with Ayatollah Khomeini declared as the supreme leader. There were multiple consequences of this revolution which reverberate today as well. One was this event saw the resurgence of political Islam in the region with the creation of a theocratic state, Islamic State of Iran. You also saw the creation of the Shiite militia group Hezbollah in Lebanon. And at the same time, the rise of Shiite majority Iran gave a moral boost to the Shia forces in neighboring Iraq, who at that time were under the rule of Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni leader. You also had, as a result of this, a growing sectarian divide between the Sunni and Shia sects in the region, which have only worsened in recent decades. In the 1980s, we had a 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war, and as a result of that war, both sides, Iran and Iraq, suffered multiple losses and depleted resources, and a depleted Iraqi side went on to participate in another war, which Ida will talk to you about.
The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the collapse of the Soviet Union, following which 3 Caucasian and 5 Central Asian states were born. As a result, communism lost its power and allure in the West Asian region. The period from 1991 to 2001 was one of power struggles both between and within the West Asian countries. It can be argued that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was linked to its historic claim long before the era of economic boom and oil exploration. Yet oil politics provides the impetus behind Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Although most OPEC members were not eager to abide by an oil quota system, Iraq desired strict regulation to oil prices in order to maintain its revenue and reduce any uncertainties on which Iraq was highly dependent. However, oil prices dropped significantly because of overproduction by other Arab states, namely Kuwait and the UAE. Tensions heightened in the Arab region. Though Saudi Arabia attempted to act as mediator, negotiation efforts failed. Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990. Both faced economic fatigue and environmental devastation began soon after. The Gulf War was a war waged by the UN-authorized coalition force from 34 nations led by the United States of America against Iraq's invasion and subsequent annexation of the state of Kuwait. Invasion of Kuwait was met with international condemnation, which brought immediate economic sanctions against Iraq by members of the UN Security Council. The Bush administration deployed American troops to Saudi Arabia, the most prominent justification being the protection of Kuwaiti territorial integrity. Thereafter, on November 29, 1990, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 678, which allowed Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw all forces from Kuwait and empowered states to use all necessary means in order to assure the security, stability, and development of this region. The scale of damage upon the evacuation of Iraqi troops was enormous, ranging from destruction caused by oil fires and oil spills. Iraqi troops set ablaze over 600 oil wells and intentionally released 11 million barrels of oil into the Arabian Gulf. The total cost incurred to Kuwait was $150 billion and $55 billion for Saudi Arabia, including cleaning costs of 800 miles of seashore. Iraqi invasion inflicted widespread physical damage and resulted in large budgetary and balance of payment deficits, disrupted domestic financial markets, halted foreign trade, and paralyzed the labor market. Further, it led to a large-scale exodus of both Kuwaitis and expatriates. During 1990 to 91, India initially adopted an ambivalent approach, condemning both Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and intrusion of external forces into the region, true to its non-aligned policy. This changed, citing India's depleting foreign reserves and weakened economy. Additionally, India permitted the US military aircraft to refuel in Bombay, stirring domestic controversy and criticism from Rajiv Gandhi's Congress. In the current context, the Gulf has moved away from its dependency on its depleting oil reserves towards a hub for finance and investment, attracting participation from other countries presented in its economic prospects. Further iterated by Ritesh.
Before we start off with the economic consequences that took place in the recent past, we should look at the trajectory of events that actually make it more interesting to look at these economic consequences. After the attacks of September 2001, the Bush administration became increasingly concerned with the West Asian region. They invaded Afghanistan in November of 2001 and had now entered the West Asian region. USA became even more concerned with weapons of mass destruction in this region when they invaded Iraq in 2003. Their first act in Iraq was to overthrow Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni leader in Shia-dominated Iraq. This eventually led to the Gulf War in 2004. After occupying Iraq and removing Hussein from power, Nouri al-Maliki, a Shia, came into power. This created a problem of sectarianism, and Al-Qaeda's presence since 2006 pushed the US troops to seek the help of many Sunni groups who were against the rule of Maliki. Al-Qaeda was eventually defeated in 2009, but Nouri al-Maliki still remained in power. USA left Iraq in 2001 once Obama replaced Bush in the US White House. But Iraq was left in a state of devastation. This further increased tensions between the Shia and the Sunni Muslims and caused more disruption in the region itself. Another significant and important event that took place in West Asia was the Arab Spring. It took place first in Tunisia in 2010 to revolt against the long-standing corrupt government of Ben Ali. This sparked revolution in the Arab states of Libya, Egypt, and now Syria. After the revolution in Libya, Gaddafi was removed, but the influx of arms spilled over to Syria. Once the revolution had begun in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria, used force to suppress the protest, but this led to the Syrian civil war. Due to increasing tensions in Syria, Muslim Islamist militia like Al-Nusra Front became ever present. Now, many groups were going against the Syrian governments, including Al-Nusra Front and other moderate groups. The formation of ISIS in late 2013 increased Syria's vulnerabilities, as the main aim of ISIS was to establish an Islamic state. They are the cause for the migrant crisis, as more and more Syrians fled their homes because of ISIS. With airstrikes from the US in 2014 and now from Russia in 2015, the situation has not been helped. Many international players with different stakes have now entered the crisis in an attempt to stop it. But this has caused further instability in Syria. Nations like USA, UK, France, and Saudi Arabia and UAE are now all involved in this crisis. Consequences of the conflict. Can you please pay attention? We have put in a lot of effort for this presentation, so can you consequences of the conflict. The fallback of any conflict in a country or a region are the high costs that need to be paid or accounted for. It stunts regional growth and causes economic slowdown, with many macroeconomic variables being affected. Regional growth has rebounded though, due to some ease in security risks in Egypt, strong credit-fueled domestic demand growth in Algeria, public investment and sanctions relief in Iran, and a rebound in oil production in oil-exporting countries like Libya, Iraq, and Iran. But before growth returned back on track, there were many costs that West Asia suffered. Oil production in the oil-exporting countries has fallen by 25% as compared to pre-Arab Spring. Countries like Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, who rely heavily on the oil sector for government revenue, suffered large revenue declines and widening fiscal deficits as a result of security challenges and falling oil prices. It creates pressure on the government to reduce fiscal deficits and government debt. This led to sharp cuts in spending and difficulties maintaining basic state functions. Growth in oil importing countries of the region was flat at 2.8% in 2014. Disruptions in transport routes limited the expansion because of large inflow of refugees from Syria to Jordan in 2013. This inflow of refugees increases the costs of neighboring governments as it increases their spending. Much will depend on development in the security situation and is partly linked to global oil prices. Security concerns will increase risks in the affected countries, where security risks will discourage tourism and reduce remittances because of the return of the migrants. Even if the conflicts do not permanently disrupt economic activity, it could disrupt or sever transport links that are critical for the small open economies in the region. As the tourism would contract, so would external investor confidence. This would especially dampen FDI in non-natural resource sectors, although FDI in natural resource sectors tends to be less sensitive to security risks. It may decline if oil prices fall further though. Fulfilling government functions while maintaining sustainable fiscal balances will require new revenues or streamlining inefficient expenditures, including fuel subsidies. Though on the upside of the Iran nuclear deal, the regional growth might increase, but the key risks remain an escalation in violence and oil price volatility. From these graphs, you can see that many countries in this region are dependent on oil production for their fiscal revenues. And because of that, they are not able to provide enough employment, and there is not enough employment growth in this region itself. In particular, there is a need to ensure that the fiscal windfalls from lower oil prices are channeled to efficient growth-enhancing public investments or towards debt reduction. The policy makers face a dual challenge, adjusting to lower oil prices and dealing with security risks in the short run while bolstering growth and employment in the long run. To generate private sector jobs and quality services, a new development model is needed in which the state facilitates competition in the domestic markets in order to generate private sector jobs and organizing public services in ways that enable citizens to hold officials accountable, thereby creating economic dependency in the region which might reduce political instability. While I have talked about the economic consequences, Ankita will continue further to explain the migrant crisis in more detail.
The sociological consequences of the migrant crisis are immense. Large numbers of children, women and men are fleeing the Syrian civil war and making the arduous journey onto Europe. News media is awash with images of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, of refugees being met with staunch police brutality in certain European countries. The migrant crisis has taken on a whole different level of crisis at the moment. According to the UNHCR, next slide, there are 4.1 Syrian refugees registered in these countries of Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt, as well as Iraq. The number of Syrian refugees, many of which are internally displaced, are unaccounted for as well. So this number is not an accurate representation. The smaller countries of Lebanon, Jordan have taken in the most refugees and are now, and economic fatigue is now threatening to derail or worsen the socio-economic and political climate in these countries, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, the smaller countries in the region. We will now conclude our presentation by looking at the linkages between India and West Asia, which is the theme of this conference. India and West Asia share a burgeoning relationship which is linked to, or which has 5 main dimensions. One of which is energy security. It's a primary link between the two countries. And there are prospects for strengthening ties along these lines in light of US's reduced dependence on West Asian oil as a result of shale gas development, production. We next have counter-terrorism cooperation between India and West Asia, as well, particularly with the rise of Islamic State in West Asia. It's become regional security has become a concern not only for West Asia, but for neighboring regions, including India. India also helps West Asia with anti-piracy initiatives in the Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. India and West Asia also have soft power initiatives like education, cultural ties, which both regions promote with one another. And we also have strong people-to-people links, and there's a large, significant Indian diaspora in West Asia, and trade and investment ties are also very important to this relationship. The Indian diaspora in West Asia, like I said, is a significant population. We have about 7 million Indians in West Asia, and India is the recipient of the highest volume of remittances in the world at around $65 billion. Half of that, about $40 billion, close to over half of that, comes from West Asia. As you can see in this graph, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these are the countries which send the most remittances to India. So the Gulf countries figure in the top 10 list of remittance sending countries to India. This is a map from 2012, by the way. India's recent engagements with the region, we've been very active in the region. One of the key events last year in 2014, June of 2014, was the Indian government's negotiated release of Indian nurses from Iraq. We brought over 200 nurses, Indian nurses who were working in Iraq and were abducted by the Islamic State. The Indian government successfully negotiated their release last year. And this year, in March of this year, in 2015, we had the Indian Navy conducted, Indian Air Force and Indian Navy and Air India conducted the Operation Rahat, which is India's rescue mission in Yemen. We not only successfully extricated over 4,000 Indians from conflict-stricken Yemen, but we also evacuated persons of other nationalities, including Pakistanis, Americans, Europeans. So India was lauded in international media as well as by international organizations and other countries for their efforts in March this year. Now the future, and hopefully this two-day conference will give you deeper and much more intimate insight into this, but India's ties with West Asia are growing, and we've seen Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited West Asia, UAE, he went to United Arab Emirates in August of this year, and he was the first Indian Prime Minister to do so in 34 years. So we have seen that the new government, the BJP government, is making a pivot towards West Asia and looking to intensify those relationships. Energy security, counter-terrorism cooperation, and trade remain the key areas of interest in this bilateral relationship between the two sides. However, although India's primary interest is to maintain a peaceful and stable West Asian region and have a stable, peaceful regional security scenario in the region, India must navigate through the multiple challenges that we've hopefully been able to highlight during the course of our presentation that continue to afflict the region, and in order to better the relationship between the two sides in the future. Thank you so much.